name's Timothy Clancy. I'm the president and founder of Dialectic Simulations Consulting, and we use systems thinking tools in these episodes to help people understand business problems that they're facing, and especially with COVID-19 and everything that's going on with the turbulence. This is a time where understanding complex systems and basic systems thinking tools for helping in problem solving can really be effective. So we're not going too deep in any episode, but we're going to try and get some high level information that I think may be useful for folks in any field, whatever your business is or applying in your personal life. So I wanted to get started. We talked last week about how to understand problems you're facing, and sort of before you even get started with solving a problem or trying to solve a problem, understand the nature of the problem you're facing. And I wanted to follow that up today with the second part. So the first thing we talked about last week was, what color was your problem? And we went through the 4 colors of problem, and this had to deal with the nature of the problem and the psychological response you as a leader would find. Now, again, this is on the YouTube channel as a segment, but the 4 colors are: green problems are obstacles, they're barriers, you get over them, they're behind you, they're pretty easy to deal with. Yellow problems are dilemmas. Dilemmas don't have an obvious right answer. They're going to be sort of how to pick between least worst options. Red problems are quandaries. That's where, in addition to being a dilemma, there's ambiguity of information, there's uncertainty, there's it's a future problem, so you don't have to solve it right now, but the level of ambiguity and uncertainty causes a lot of difficulty in picking what's the right course of action to do. And then purple problems are predicaments. A predicament is a quandary whose time has arrived. You know, quandary, you're out there in the future, do you have to solve this problem? Predicament, you have to solve it right now. So we went over these last week. These are the colors of problems. What I wanted to do today was sort of expand on this with talk about problem types. So problem types get into a little bit more detail of the nature of the problem you're facing and how you can think of it in 2 ways. And this is presented in this chart, and anyone who's seen me in my consulting engagements, I use this chart all the time to explain types of problems. And just to clear it, on the left hand, the vertical axis is how hard is it to get agreement among stakeholders. And you see it goes from easy to hard. And we call this, in systems thinking, we call this behavioral complexity. This is about, you may have stakeholders who have different values, different vocabularies, different way of thinking about problems. They may even recognize different kinds of problems. There might not be agreement on what a problem is between different stakeholders. So the higher you go up in here, the higher your behavioral complexity and the more different types of stakeholders you're dealing with and those challenges of behavior. On the lower axis, the horizontal, is how hard is it to identify a solution? And this has to do with something we call dynamic complexity. When it's easy, you can see the steps in a row. It's kind of like following a cooking recipe. If you fail to put in an ingredient, you understand where you made the mistake. Dynamic complexity, there's a lot of interlocking pieces and parts and moving items, and these interrelationships and the sheer complexity of the dynamics makes it very difficult to understand where the problem is, how it's being recorded. And these 2 dimensions combine to create the 4 types of problems we usually deal with. So when you have low behavioral complexity and low dynamic complexity, you have what's called a tame problem. These are, everyone shares the same vocabulary. You know, Mike's on here, he has an electrical background, right? Everyone going into electrical backgrounds, they have the same certifications, they have the same vocabulary, they're working from the same understandings for the most part, they know each other's languages, they generally agree on what a problem is not. There's a high degree of uniformity, so there's low behavioral complexity. It may still be dynamically complex, but if you're doing simple wiring, you know how the wires put together and you can understand that. Same thing with other business problems. Accounting, for example, tends to be tame problems where people share the same language and it's very well documented what's going on. But as you increase in behavioral complexity, if you simply increase the behavioral complexity, think about if you were trying to cook in a kitchen and you had 5 chefs, right? The old saying is, too many chefs in the kitchen spoil the meal. That's because it's increasing the behavioral complexity. There's more people, they may disagree on how, think about Thanksgiving dinner. There's mom's way to cook it, there's grandma's way to cook it, there's dad's way of cooking it, there may be your uncle carves it this way, or there's all these things and these beliefs and understanding, even on something as simple as cooking Thanksgiving dinner, you begin to have behavioral complexity, and we call these wicked problems. wicked because you may think you have a solution, but because someone else sees the problem in a different way or doesn't understand the language and values with which you're speaking of, they may disagree with the solution because they have a different perspective. These are wicked problems. If you increase the dynamic complexity, but you keep it low behavioral complexity, we call that a mess or a messy problem. It's kind of like a bowl of spaghetti. You can't figure out, all these noodles are dumped in a bowl together. You can't figure out where one strand starts and the other one ends. It's all interlocking and it's really hard to untangle. And the problem with messy problems is that it's not as easy to reduce it and get to that obvious clean solution, because you may have rapidly changing information. It may be hard to get information. There may be lots of things to consider in your information. Again, this isn't about behaviors. This is just the dynamic complexity of the problem itself. And when you combine these two, when you have a problem of high behavioral complexity and high dynamic complexity, you have what we call a wicked mess. And these are the hardest problems of all to solve, in that you have really complex, intricate problems to analyze. But on top of that, you have a wide amount of audiences that have different values and perceptions and beliefs. The way they define problems, the kinds of things they look to solve problems, all vary. And this is most of the problems we face in the, in a complex business, at a certain level, become wicked messes. You could certainly say it about the country too, because of obviously there's polarization and the differences of opinions between the political groups. But even in businesses and companies, when you start getting problems that no one can easily pick out the analytical answer, and there's different beliefs of what's the right way to fix this, what's the right approach to do, you may see these type of wicked messes emerge. And this is where we spend a lot of our time trying to work with folks, is when they're in these types of problems. Now, over the last 25 years, I've done dozens of improvement projects. So each one of these little squares is kind of a notional problem-solving project I've been involved in. And it was interesting to me when I mapped this out. Generally, the problems I ran into fell in this band, and they sort of notionally in a band here, where there was the super easy problems. They didn't want to pay for a consultant, so they didn't bring me in. I might have one there, but there's no return on investment. These can be solved in-house or with existing resources. Then there's a wide, very dense band of problems that range from the tame. Some start going into the wicked, some start getting into the messes, but they definitely didn't get too much in the wicked messes because the belief was that problem was too hard. Now, keep in mind, from my background, I have a background in Lean, Six Sigma, Agile, those sort of process improvements, and the tools that we use for process improvement lended itself well to solving problems in this space, but kind of broke down when we try to get in problems of these space. So I might have a couple projects there, but not a whole lot. And over that time, I learned that each of these quadrants has a different set of tools that if you know what kind of problem you're facing, you should pick the right tool for the job. So this is just a sort of a quick snapshot, but Tame Problems, this is where your Lean Kaizen, your Six Sigma green belts, maybe some structured systems thinking comes in. But as you get into wicked problems, this is more where you're trying to get everyone to sing from the same sheet of music or to read from the same page. So things like cultural change, change management techniques, structured systems thinking that are based on collaboration, mental models, understanding the personas and how they differ, those sort of structured systems thinking tools, lean leader behaviors. These are all tools that are designed to reconcile those differences between groups. That's where this, down in the mess though, this is where you need your heavy stats, your math analytics, your projects like that. So this is where your Six Sigma Black Belt projects come in, your predictive analytics like machine learning, AI, things like that, even simulation science, using agent-based model or system dynamics. Wicked mess, this is where prescriptive analytics comes most in handy, and a full system dynamics, because here you have to map not just quantified dynamic complexity, but also that behavioral complexity of people interacting in the system and all of these pieces working together. Now, this can seem daunting, that if you have a wicked mess problem, it's very hard to solve it in the wicked mess space. But one of the tricks I've learned over time is that no matter where you are in this chart, you can use tools to move it to a different part of the chart. So say we had a wicked mess and our company was not good at the math, but we really were good at the diplomacy and the cultural change. We might use those tools to switch it from a wicked mess down into a mess by resolving the behavioral complexity, getting everyone to understand and at least talk in the same way. It de-escalates a wicked mess problem into a messy problem. You still need to solve it, and that's hard with the math, but you've taken the wicked component out of it. Likewise, if you're really good at analytics, you're an engineering company, you're really strong on that part, you may be able to do the analysis that moves a wicked mess into a wicked problem space. And you can actually, in some projects, over a series of time, I've done some things where you go from a wicked mess to a wicked problem to a tame problem, and then you solve it in the tame problem space. It seems laborious, but that's actually faster than trying to solve it in the wicked mess space. So just keep in mind when you face these kinds of problems, understanding what type of problem you're facing in addition to its color and what that means in terms of tool sets and how you can use them and how you might shift it is really important when you get into problem solving, especially in complex systems, because these types of complex systems are going to tend to be less of the obstacles. They're going to be more of the dilemmas, the quandaries, and the predicaments, which are already psychologically harder to solve. So don't get yourself wrapped up too much in trying to solve a wicked mess problem in the wicked mess space. If you can shift it and de-escalate either that dynamic or behavioral complexity, that can help a great deal. So we'll pause here to see if there's any questions. Welcome everyone who's joining. Thanks. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to talk about deals directly with COVID-19. And many have heard this term Black Swan event. And I wanted to go over what is a Black Swan event? What does that mean? How does it function? What does it mean from a systems thinking standpoint? And how does that relate to COVID? So what is a black swan? So a black swan event has three criteria. It's usually a surprise event to the observer. That doesn't mean that it's a surprise to anyone, but it's a surprise event to the observer. It has a major impact or effect, and it's often rationalized in hindsight as predictable. But the nature of black swan events is that they are almost by definition statistically unlikely or improbable, and yet they have this major effect. And then afterwards, in hindsight, we sort of said, well, we should have seen that coming. So COVID-19 is an excellent example of a black swan event. Another was the financial collapse of 2009. Certainly, people before 2009 were saying there's a problem in the housing market. I said there was one going back to 2004. Certainly, people have warned about pandemics and the potential for a global pandemic. But for most business leaders, this came as a surprise. COVID-19 was not something they started their calendar. You know, when they sat down to the strategic planning for 2020, they didn't say, oh yeah, we're gonna have a global pandemic that collapses the stock markets, shuts down all global travel. More than half the country is gonna be in lockdown conditions. And yeah, that's fine. And by the way, we need to, improve our safety. They just weren't planning that kind of strategy. So for businesses, COVID-19 for most was a surprise event. It certainly has had a major impact, and it's had this rationalizing hindsight. In fact, in some ways, COVID has been like a black swan cannonballing into your pond. So if you think about your local business area, your environment as being like a pond, COVID-19 came like a black swan cannonballing into the pond and sends ripples of turbulence out. Part of this episode is talking about turbulence and understanding it. When a black swan hits, because it has a major effect, it's going to create these ripple effects. And the way you feel these ripple effects depends on your proximity to where the black swan lands. We can think about this as when COVID-19 first hit, it hit hardest in airlines and travel industries, events, anything that was people to people related at mass size. It hit that area almost immediately. I remember in March, we were dealing with some clients that were in conference planning and event planning, and they got absolutely hammered by this. And it rapidly, as those ripples spread out, your consequences were, you weren't immune to it. If you were, when the cities began shutting down and states began closing down and people began withdrawing from consumers, that ripple effect was further out in the pond, but would be restaurants, bars, entertainment venues, those certainly got hit. And even further out are the businesses that were sort of, might be white collar or blue collar, but not front facing with the public, where yes, they could still operate, but they were either losing business because they didn't have the work coming in from construction or things like that, or they had to remove their workers from an office environment and shift them to a work from home environment. So your location in the pond, right, relative to where the cannonball of Black Swan event arrives, determines how large an impact. You can think of this wave somewhat like a tsunami. The closer you are, the bigger this wave is going to be, and the more impact it's going to have on your business. The problem is that, as we talked about in turbulence, these waves come from multiple directions. And so these Black Swan events often amplify themselves based off the reactions we have. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But when it comes to, a big question we deal with right now that clients is like, how do I survive this? And we've been working on that for the last few months, but they're like, how do I not have this not happen again, right? What's the right business model for a Black Swan event? And this gets into the system structure of understanding. Think of your business model. If you're in that pond, right, your business model is a structure that comes up from the pond floor, right? It sits on the floor of the pond and it may go up above the water. If that wave hits your structure and blows it apart, you're going bankrupt. Your business will go under, you're doing it. So you can think of the business model as this structure that's got to absorb this wave coming. And the closer you are to that cannonball, the bigger and more forceful the wave is going to be. And therefore, the more important your business model. The further you are out from it, you may not need to change your business model structure, but in something this large and this massive with this many ripple effects, it's hard to believe that not every business structure is being challenged in one way or another. So what are some of the business model options that you can think about when dealing with Black Swan events? Well, there's 4 general ones you hear about, and I'll go through each one in order. But from a high level, you can have a robust business model, you can have a resilient business model, you can have an adaptive business model, or you can have what's called anti-fragile. These are all very different types of model, and although I'm going to be describing them individually, it's important to know that it's very rare for one business to only have one model, right? It's probably going to be a mix of things, and there's going to be higher and lower prevalences of these 4 characteristics within any one business. Our business is mainly robust, but we do have a few adaptive parts. Our business is almost entirely anti-fragile, except for these parts which are resilient. So I'm going to be presenting it to keep it simple as sort of a one business model type, but in reality, businesses often are a mix of these. And you can think of these models as, again, in metaphor, how do they react to that wave coming at them from the Black Swan event? The Black Swan cannonballs into the pond. You've got your business structure from some distance away from that impact. The wave's coming at you. It will recede over time, but when it hits your structure, how that wave is processed and reacts is the basis of these business models. So the simplest one, and I think the traditional one, is a robust business model. You're building your business structure like a dam levee, right? It's big, it's thick, it's built with concrete, it sits there above the surface, and it's designed to absorb that wave and just bounce it back off. You've got depth, you've got resources, you've built robustness into it, and you have, your intent is to absorb the wave. Well, as we know, with most dams or levees, that works to a point in time. But if a strong enough wave comes at you, it's going to crack that robustness like an eggshell. It's just going to blow right through it. And you see this when large tsunamis. So the reason Black Swan events tend to be called Black Swans and just not another week in the office is they have so much strength. These little events that cause ripples are happening all the time. And most businesses that are robust are simply absorbing it and moving on. But a Black Swan, almost by definition, the wave is so powerful, it just blows through that robustness. And that's where a lot of businesses are struggling right now, is they've only had a robust model that has gotten blown away, or the depth's been exhausted, the resources have been exhausted, and they have nothing left. A resilient model is designed to ride out the wave. So again, if we use the metaphor of the pond, the resilient model might be a slimmer model where the water is just designed to go over it, or maybe it's even beneath the surface. It's not trying to stop that turbulence with force. It's simply trying to ride it out in a smooth and efficient way that prevents it from breaking. Now, this is very useful in certain kinds of black swans because and what does resilient mean in a business sense? It might be low cost structure. It might be a lot of pieces and parts that are redundant. So if one area goes down, we have backup somewhere else. There's a lot of effort that's been done in disaster recovery to build resilience. So yes, the wave's coming over, but it's going to pass over us and we're going to be okay. Again, though, a big enough black swan event can really challenge this because in this case now, the resilience we're talking about the multiple dimensions of turbulence. The resilience is often built for one kind of things, but now in a black swan event, you have these ripple effects cascading throughout the pond, and you got all this turbulence coming at you. It can break apart the resilience structure. And again, there's no one answer to this. These are just the pros and cons of each one. An adaptive business model is sort of like it changes or attempts to change to the sort of the velocity of the water. So again, this metaphor of a wave coming at you, an adaptive model might try and literally transform itself from one way of acting when the pond is calm to another way of acting when the wave's coming at it. And this can be powerful. The challenge is that you have to see the wave coming, and then you have to be fast enough adapting to put in place your adaptation before that wave hits. So you see this a lot in technology companies, that like mobile companies that try to say, well, we're just going to pivot to a new model because we're doing mobile devices or we're doing mobile apps and we can change what we're doing. Well, that's easier when everything you do is digital. If you're in a brick and mortar fixed location, or you got a group of workers that are doing a very certain skilled trade or work style, it's harder to do. Those fast adaptations are trickier, and the adaptive model then presumes that you both can see it coming far enough in advance and or have enough time to adapt. Otherwise, you tend to get blown away, just like the robust model. You're in the process of changing, or you didn't even see it coming when it hits you. And this leads to the last one, which is anti-fragile. And this one's a bit tricky to understand, but the anti-fragile business model doesn't try and defeat the volatility or the turbulence that comes from the black swan event. The anti-fragile model actually seeks that out and uses it to amplify its business. Now, this can be a little confusing, but all of these things, black swan and these definitions, come from a gentleman named Nassim Taleb, who defined them over a course of works in the early 2000s. But he defined anti-fragile as a relationship that a fragile business, which he would define as robust, resilient, and adaptive, when turbulence increased, their profit and sort of responsiveness decrease. So, I mean, that makes sense, right? You're getting hit by these waves. You're focused on hunkering down with resilient or riding it out as robust or trying to adapt. You're not necessarily profiting off it. You're just trying to get through it. Those are what he would call fragile business models. Anti-fragile business models, as the volatility increases or the turbulence increases, they increase as well. They actually are being heightened by the presence of volatility in the system. And that's a very tricky concept to grasp until you think about things like, if you think about stock market and trades, there are some people who day trade, and the only way they make money is off high volatility in the market, right? If the market's steady and calm, the person who just buys and holds is going to do fine. But if there's a high volatility in the market, those day traders they don't care about the stock, they're just in and out trading, they tend to make a lot more profits when there's high volatility. That's a version of anti-fragile. And that exposes the challenge of anti-fragile business models, is that they're not as good in steady eddy, simple, calm ponds, right? If you are if you've developed an anti-fragile model and there's no volatility in your system, then you've built a lot of investment and resources in something you're not going to recoup or get back because you're not experiencing that turbulence. However, if you call it right and you're in either a pond that gets a lot of turbulence or a black swan hits, that anti-fragility model is going to allow you to accelerate up while everyone else is just trying to stay even or minimize how far they go down. You're actually accelerating up. So it can be a very powerful business model, but it's just tricky to predict when's the right time to use it. And for all of these types of business models, how do you know which one to pick? And again, I said I introduced them sort of one at a time, but the reality is different businesses will have mixes and blends of these types of elements of robustness, resilience, adaptive, and anti-fragile. The structured systems thinking is the way that we look at the system, we look at the pond you're in, we look at the nature of the events that are coming at you and the turbulence they can create, and that's how you design what the right business model is, right? If you are in a certain industry that works a certain way and all your competitors are robust, but you sense there's volatility coming at the thing, you may not want to go anti-fragile, but you may want to go resilient or adaptive, or you may want to increase resilience and adaptive. And that's, you use the system structure to understand that system and understand what's the right play, what are the trade-offs. Again, all of these types of changes you make to your business model involve trade-offs. There's no one easy bullet that just says we'll always be anti-fragile and that will be the best. It's always a matter of trade-offs, but understanding what the four kinds of business models are and how to blend them and what the impacts are probably informs the decision making of how are we going to ride out future things like COVID-19, or how are we going to make sure this doesn't happen to us again. And of course, you can't just have a business that only reacts to the last black swan. There's an adage you'll hear, we're fighting the last war, right? That tends to happen in businesses too. There was a lot of fear of, Y2K introduced the concept of the one-off disaster and disaster recovery. So a lot of businesses built resilience of extra locations, backup generators, things like that. They weren't really prepared for the financial collapse, which was a financial black swan. And then a lot in the last 8 years have been, okay, financial black swan, we're going to make sure our house is in order, our debts are aligned, we're not going to be too risky with our investment strategies. And now COVID hits. That's the nature of black swan events, is you cannot predict them in advance, and you cannot rely that the last black swan tells you what the next one's going to be. So picking these strategies, you got to be really cognizant of what your specific work environment is and what's going to help in that particular pond for when the black swan hits. So, all right. So if there's, just check to see if there's any questions. Tony, welcome. Thanks for joining. Good to see people. All right. So we're going to jump into the last topic I wanted to go over today. And it kind of ties together a couple of the things that we're talking about. Is obviously COVID-19. In the last week, we have accelerated wave 1.5 has been going on for about a month now, but we're really accelerating where it's gotten national attention. You're seeing the infection rate spike up to, I think we're now at about 50,000 a day. So the question has come, do we close again? And the turbulence that I want to talk from a business standpoint is about the system structure of this discussion between the COVID-19 infections and the closing and reopening discussion, and how we use structured systems thinking to understand that turbulence and then make better decisions. Well, we can't always decide for the political or the government side, but better decisions for our business. So wanted to go over that real quick. And this is a diagram that came out from JP Morgan, and it looked at opening and reclosing as a function of this oscillating wave pattern. So on the left here, to clear the chart, net infections, these are the total number of infections. And then on the bottom is time. And so what you see, this oscillating pattern is a series of waves. You hear about wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, or I'll say wave 1.5. That's what these peak and troughs are. Wave 1 would be up to the peak and down to the bottom, wave 2, wave 3. And what they're calling out here, and this was originally released in April, and I did an infomullet on it, but I wanted to do something here with structured systems thinking. They're pointing out that different reactions, there's going to be multiple waves to this, and they may be over time until a vaccine's developed, we will be living in a multi-wave world. So that's what this diagram is trying to show. And I wanted to explain it. When you get into advanced systems thinking, right, those of you who have seen me do my loop diagrams and things like that, sometimes you don't even need to build those. You can simply look at a behavior pattern like this, and with the theories of systems thinking, understand the structure this is representing. So this is a little bit advanced, but it shows you how you could use structured systems thinking to understand something like this and derive meaningful business decisions. So in systems thinking, we call this an oscillating pattern. It's the wave pattern, and we call it an attenuating oscillation. That means that the wave at the earlier points are larger than the wave at the end points. it's shrinking. The size of the waves are shrinking over time. If it was increasing, we'd call that an exploding oscillation. And in structured systems thinking, we know that to have any oscillation takes what's called a second order negative feedback loop. And again, I'm not going to diagram it out. It's a type of feedback loop that we teach people how to use, but simply knowing that you need at least one negative feedback loop, second order. Negative feedback loops have goals, and the goal is what the feedback effect is trying to meet or max or reach, is a equilibrium to that goal. Well, we also know from structured systems thinking that if you have an oscillation that shrinks in size or increases in size, that can't be produced by one negative feedback loop alone. There's got to be two negative feedback loops, and they have to be interacting. Now, if a negative feedback loop has a goal that it's trying to reach, an equilibrium it's trying to reach, when we look at this for COVID, opening and reopening, we can kind of begin to say, what are those negative feedback loops? Well, there's one that's pretty obvious in that the infection itself, the pandemic itself, is a negative feedback loop seeking a goal level, which is a equilibrium of a percentage of population that's kind of its maximum infection rate. So you can think about these rises in the wave as being that first negative feedback loop of the pandemic itself, seeking a goal of as many people as we can sustainably infect. Not that the virus is actually thinking this, of course, because it's non-sentient, but we can pretend that if the virus could think, it's kind of saying, I want to infect as many people as I can at the maximum of my R-OT value, and based on the dynamics of this, it'll be a certain level of the population. So it's rising the infections. That other second negative feedback loop also has a goal, and its goal, at least in this case, is to flatten the curve. It's the policy goal of, we don't want to have a whole bunch of uncontrolled infections because that will swamp our hospitals. And so, and that equilibrium, it's not zero, but it's a low enough infections that it's beneath this curve level that we know for hospital capacity. These two negative feedback loops interacting together produce this pattern. And the way that this works, you can kind of think of it as infections rise, the emphasis of closing down, putting stricter social distancing, all the elements that we've done in pandemic responses increases until the point that we have a lockdown order, stay-at-home order, very strict social distancing or masks, and then that begins declining the infection rate until we relax. And that's what these red circles are. It's a decision to relax the policy decision of staying closed or staying with distancing or things like that. And these two negative feedback loops are constantly interacting. And the way you can think about who's going to win that interaction is the relative speed at which those loops reach their goal. So the pandemic has an infection rate of a fairly high rate of speed. It takes a few days. It can double within a week or 2 weeks. It's got a high speed to its point of increasing infections, and it's a relatively fixed speed. It's going to, those parameters aren't going to change much. But policy making, you can think of policy making as slow or fast decision making, either slow to close or fast to close, and slow to open or fast to open. And that is probably and specifically here I want to talk about reopenings. That is probably the key variable that's driving this behavior, is how fast or slow are decisions made to reopen once we have already closed down. And again, I talked about this back in April and made a kind of a forecast here that's come true. And this was informed by structured systems thinking. We know in structured systems thinking, it's the relative speed of those two negative feedback loops to their goals that will determine this behavior. And this seems really fancy and scientific and math and confusing, but think of it like you're standing in a shower, one of those old showers that you turn the knob to the left to get it hot, and it's not getting hot, so you turn it more, and then it's scalding, and so you turn it all the way to the right to get it really cold, and then it's freezing. Well, what's happening is there's a time delay between when you make a choice to turn the knob and the pipes say, okay, we need hot water. And that time delay, if you keep turning that knob fast because you're not happy with the result, that you're constantly sending a signal, more heat, more heat, more heat, and then it comes out really hot. Well, then you turn it to the right, and it takes a time delay to get that cold water in place. And because you're not waiting long enough, you just keep turning it to the right and you overshoot. So this concept of overshoot and undershoot is the sort of the simple way to think of a shower of what's happening with these opening decisions, right? And what it means is, practically speaking, the faster we make a decision to reopen under the belief that we are safe, the more likely we are to have an additional wave. Just as if we didn't wait for the water to get up a little hot, we just kept turning it fast. We're not waiting very long. If you wait a while in a shower, and ideally you're not standing in it, you can feel that temperature adjust and go, okay, that was the right level. I don't need to turn anymore. You just turn it once, you wait and see, and then you adjust again. But if you're insistent on fast turns, you're going to overshoot and undershoot. Same thing with the reopenings. As we reopened quickly, the decision making to reopen was far too fast, and we didn't have the full information of what was actually going on. We reopened too quickly, and now we're experiencing this wave effect. In fact, we didn't even go down to a full trough. We were sort of midway, which is why I call it wave 0.15. But to this effect, it's the same thing. We were fast to reopen, and now we're dealing with the consequences of it. And you can think of this is obviously a government choice, whether the state's open or not, that's a government choice. But you can think of this in your business as well. In a situation like this, where you're dealing with an oscillatory pattern, the pandemic is one side and your business decision is that other, what goal are you seeking to achieve, and how fast is your decision making relative to seeking that goal? How fast are you going to turn that handle to try and get the water where you want it to be? And the faster you turn that handle, the more rapid your decision making, the more likely you're going to overshoot or undershoot the actual place you want to be. So kind of the guidance I'm giving a lot of clients is, as much as you can, right? If depending on the nature of the problem you have, as much as you can, be slow on your decisions that are sort of exposing yourself back up into the virus. Be quick on decisions that protect you from the virus, but slow that expose. And that means, I've been advising clients since March. Be quick to close, slow to open. You can talk about schools. Be quick to move that work from home, but slow to shift it back. And this is a easy way to think about it. Quick to do something that protects you from the virus, slow to undo that thing, which at least at the business level or the organization level may protect you to some extent from these oscillations. Of course, there's limits to what you can do because you're existing in a pond with everyone else and they're all making decisions as well. But when it comes to your own business decision making, your family decision making, your school or church or whatever, you can use this kind of system structure to guide you. And of course, this is a simplification. The reality is those two negative loops could be attached to many more loops that spread out in a large complex thing. I've just simplified the interacting point, but you can use this understanding to guide your business decisions of how fast are we going to make a decision relative to our choice between safety for COVID-19 and other business priorities we have. So that's just a way doing that. So let's check for questions. Mike Lyons, I work at a residential, commercial, and industrial electrical shop. There have been a lot of changes we've had to adapt to. However, many of our customers and their safety has limited us staying busy as we normally are this time of year. Now we have to adapt to schedules and less number of workers on various jobs, right? And that's a different kind of, so there's and Mike, that's a great point. I describe the two negative feedback loops as one being your COVID-19 pandemic and the other being a safety response. But you may also think of it as like the changes of our customers as one negative loop. They have a goal that they're seeking their goal. That's one negative loop. And your goal is to keep employees employed and keep productive, but also not go bankrupt. So again, you have two negative feedback loops, and the decision making, the relative strength of the speed in each of those loops to achieve its goal, the interaction of that tells you a lot about whether you should be making fast decisions or slow decisions. And it can guide you in like, people were asking me, do I let workers go quickly or do I let them go slowly? Well, it matters based on how your client base is reacting. That's going to determine it. You can't do these decisions in isolation. You have to understand how both negative feedback loops are working. So that's what I had for today to discuss. I'll answer any questions that there are. I'll stay on for a few extra minutes, but that's what I wanted to get across today for problem solving and turbulence. Again, you can think of these things all coming together. When that black swan of COVID-19 drops in the pond, what happens is it unleashes a whole bunch of quandaries, predicaments, dilemmas that are now coming at your business like a wave. And that wave ripple effect depending on your business model, it's robust, it's resilient, it's adaptive, or it's anti-fragile, is going to depend on its capacity to withstand that wave or absorb it or let it ride over, or in the case of anti-fragile, benefit from it, benefit from these waves. Those kind of problems and understanding those problem types is exactly what we're talking about doing. And then finally, to understand one of those kind of waves, a turbulence that's created from opening and closing, we can use systems thinking without even creating a structure, just knowing the nature of what feedback structure must be in place. And there's a whole literature on why it must be in place, but there's a logical foundation of why an oscillating pattern requires an attenuating or exploding oscillating pattern requires two negative feedback loops to create. I could go through it, but it would take an hour and a half and might be over the heads. But there's a reason why you need these system structures to generate these behaviors. And knowing that, you don't have to create the structure, you don't have to create the model. You can just look at a pattern of behavior and go, okay, that's an oscillating pattern. Is it getting smaller? Is it exploding? And begin to make decisions with your systems thinking. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Hope the episode has been helpful. We're going to splice this and put it up on YouTube into segments, and we'll do these every once week, maybe once every 2 weeks, see how that goes. But appreciate all the interest and the questions. Thanks a lot and have a good day. Take care. Appreciate your time today. If you have any questions on structured systems thinking, have a problem you'd like our help on, or want to know more about developing your own capabilities in systems thinking, please reach out at the email below. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in what we do and want to follow our journey, I've added our LinkedIn and Twitter information. And we plan to regularly update this channel with quick tips and case studies to help you get the most out of your systems thinking and lean efforts. If you want to be notified whenever we add new video content, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the red subscribe button below this video.